and happy to see a bunch of people whose names I don't recognize. So hello, welcome to Trans Drupal. My Twitter handle is on that slide. It's also at the top of every subsequent slide. It's generally the best way to interact with me overall. And my website's there too. And the URL will be at the end of the presentation. But I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of resources, and they will all be linked there. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nikki. I use they, them pronouns like my profile indicates, and that's because I am a non-binary trans person who does not identify as a man or as a woman. And we'll talk more about what transness means. We'll do like a quick gender primer. I'm also a PhD candidate at Arizona State University, where I study the ways that we think about data and how that data does violence to trans people and upholds white supremacy. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about trans people, whiteness, and computing. So I'm also a software engineer, and I have been for a super long time. I was a software engineer before Drupal, but here's my little bit of Drupal cred, which is that my D.O account is 11 years old. Okay, so a couple of notes about what we're not talking about today. We are not talking about tech specifically for trans people. And again, we'll talk about like how I'm using the word trans a little bit later. So the text on the slide is an interview by a researcher named Oliver Hameson and his team. Oliver researches the way trans people use and need technology. And he and his team came up with a bunch of things that trans people need. And so we're not talking about how to make tech for trans specific needs. There's a ton of great research about that. And a lot of that will, again, be on the resources page. And just one quick example is the project Refuge Restrooms, which helps people find gender-neutral bathrooms, safe bathrooms to use. We are also not talking about how trans people make technology, how trans people work on teams, how to recruit trans people. That's a picture of a pipeline. We're not going to talk about the pipeline and the leaky pipeline. There is a session here, and it's linked at the bottom of the slide, called Diverse Community Starts with a Diverse Team. I invite you to check that out if that's a thing that you're thinking about. I'm also happy to share my thoughts on pipeline conversations off the record after the session. If you have thoughts on how to keep and recruit, yes, I will share the deck, and it'll be on my website. Someone just asked in chat. My website is listed on the slides. If you are a person who's wondering about team culture and how to make the teams that are building technology safe and inclusive for trans people, I would like to invite you to think with these two people. So think with Sage Sharp. Some of you might know her. Some of you know them. They're super engaged in the Drupal community. And Cass and Tuck, who run a consulting firm. All three of them are trans. All three of them are thinking about how to create inclusive communities for trans people. And then just a quick plug for trans people who make tech. This is Lynn Conway, and she transitioned in the late 60s, and she worked both at IBM and Xerox PARC and on some of the biggest supercomputers that we have. So this idea that trans people in tech is new, trans people making tech is new, it's totally false. And I just like to plug Lynn because she's like been an amazing programmer for 40 years. Okay, a quick disclaimer. First, this is a really fast talk, and so there's a bunch of stuff I'm not going to cover. This is also a really fast talk, so there's a bunch of stuff I'm going to get wrong. I might slip up and use the wrong pronouns for people. I might slip up and say something incorrect. All of those things happen because we're all human and messing things up all the time. There are a bunch of things that I think are important that are missing because we're trying to cram a bunch of stuff in. So I just kind of want to like put that out there. This is like a super rushed high-level gloss. And also a quick content warning, I will be using medical terms for genitals. So if that's something that is triggering for you, I'll try to remember to warn before I use them. So we're going to do a quick Gender 101, because in order to think about how to make tech that includes trans people, how to design for trans people, we have to understand what it means to be a trans person at a very high level in like 5 minutes. Okay, one thing, when we think about tech, one of the things that we tend to think as being fundamental is like that computing is based on a binary, right? We've got ones and zeros. We've got a pretty classic assumption that there is simply no other way for computing to work. Things are just binary. False. So here's a false thing. In the late 60s, nope, in the late 40s, 30s, Russian computer scientists made a ternary system. And there's a picture of this on the slide. So this ternary system didn't use ones and zeros. It needed 0, 1, and -1. And it took that ternary logic as the basis for computing, as the foregrounded logic. So obviously that's not what we ended up using, but it does show that even these things that we find to be fundamental are themselves sort of constructed, that things don't have to just be on or off. They can be -1, 1, and neutral in the middle. And so this is the same, it's sort of analogous to the gender binary, right? We think, and we are taught, and we are indoctrinated, especially here in the United States. And most of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be from a United States perspective, thinking about that there are men and women, and that's just what there are, and that's just what happens. And many of us have moved past that, but some of us haven't. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what happens when a baby is born is that baby is born and the doctor looks at that baby's genitals. And if the doctor sees a penis, they write down male. And if the doctor sees a vagina, they write down female, right? And this is called the sex assigned at birth. And so when a baby is born and those genitals are somehow hard to distinguish, somehow not immediately obvious, a lot of times they will then perform violent and coercive surgery on that baby to make the genitals look like something we think they're supposed to. And if you want more information about that, I want to direct you to Hill Malatino's work. They did a really amazing talk at Google, really accessible. It'll be linked on the website, and it's on the bottom there, about what it's like to be an intersex person, about what it's like to have, I think they use the phrase like ambiguous genitals, right? So babies are born on a regular basis, some say as common as redheads, who have genitals that are not clearly penises or vaginas. And there's nothing wrong, right, with these babies. So we've got this system which looks at genitals and puts people into categories of male or female and makes them fit if they don't already. And then we end up with this system where you either experience alignment with that assignment or you experience misalignment with that assignment. So when I'm using the word transgender, I'm using it in the broadest sense possible, which is that you are a person who does not experience alignment with the sex that you were assigned at birth. There's lots of nuance that people are adding to the word transgender. There's lots of other categories. Some people who are non-binary, some people who don't identify as men and women who are non-binary don't use the word trans. Some people do. But in general, if you were assigned male at birth and you feel like a man, you're a cisgendered person. If you're not, you fall broadly under this transgender category. You know, in the community, we don't want to use labels that people don't want. So I'm never going to say that someone is or is not trans, but this is how I'm using the words, and these are the definitions that I'm using. To give you a sense of scale, about 1.4 million adults identify as transgender. And I think the important word there is identify. There are a lot more people who are transgender who are not out, right? So this data comes from a survey. It comes from people who are willing to check a box saying, yes, I am a transgender person. We don't know the actual number. And we also don't know how many people kind of are still questioning, right? There are some folks who are out, there are some folks who know but are not out, and there are some folks who are still figuring it out. So to give you a sense of like how many more people might be trans, we can think about how almost 50% of LGBTQIA2S, so lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer and questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, and more, is what that acronym stands for, of Americans are in the closet at work. That means at work, they're pretending to be cisgendered and heterosexual, which is a lot. 83% globally, so across the world, studies show that approximately 80% of people are not cisgendered and or not heterosexual and have not told anybody about it. So that 1.4 million number might be much larger. So when we're thinking about like is this a large enough population to think for? The answer is yes, no matter what, but also numerically is yes. Part of the reason that folks are in the closet is because of the influence of colonialism and the violence of colonialism and patriarchy. And this is something that I want to talk about forever, but cannot. So I want to, up here is a quote from a book called The Invention of Women, about the way that women were created by colonialism in Africa, by white settlers coming into the African continent and colonizing places. And the main thing that I want to point out is that this act of taking land, which happened in Africa, certainly happened in America, the European colonists brought with them ideas about how gender should be. And those ideas did not exist in the places that they landed. So it's not to say that there weren't men and women in these places, but to say that the way that gender organized society, the way that we were split, the way that our tasks were divided was totally different. And that a lot of societies that got colonized had a very expansive sense of what gender was. And they had a lot of ways for people to perform gender, for people to say, well, I have a vagina, but I want to do male tasks, right? I want to be a property owner. I want to take a wife. I want to be part of the ruling system. All of those things were possible very expansively before colonialism. And the relationship between the gender binary and colonialism helps us, I think, perhaps think also about the way that one's gender identity, one's sexual orientation is deeply tied to the way that one is perceived racially, especially in the United States. So I'm not talking explicitly about race in this talk, but all of this is inflected by one's racial identity in the United States, especially. And when we're thinking about designing for trans users, we're also thinking about designing for users who are marginalized in a variety of ways. And one of the most marginalized populations, right, is Black trans women who are murdered at an alarmingly high rate. So all of this includes race fundamentally, even though I'm not explicitly putting it on the slide. And I just want to like super put a pin in that. So at a high level, we have an understanding that gender does not equal the genitals that you have. Lots of women have penises, lots of men have vaginas, lots of people who are not men and women have penises and vaginas, right? Your gender is also not equivalent to your secondary sex characteristics. Those sex characteristics are things like beards, breasts, facial hair, or body hair, whether or not you menstruate. Gender is not equivalent to any of those things either. Lots of men have periods and use tampons. Lots of men give birth. Gender is also not equal to the clothes that you wear, or how long or short your hair is, or how deep or high your voice is, or all these other things that we tend to perceive as being related to one's gender. So what, if gender is not all of these things, what is gender? And the easiest, I think, way to think about it in this context is that one's individual gender is whatever they say it is. And if you look at a person and think their gender is something and they tell you it's something else, they're correct. And that to me feels really simple and very sort of chill, right? Just believe people when they tell you what their gender is. And I also just, before we move on to how to explicitly design for trans people, I want to put a highlighter over the difference between one's individual gender, which is my gender is whatever I say it is, and the social gender, the way that we organize people around gender, the way that we segregate bathrooms, the way that we have bridesmaids parties and bachelor parties, the ways that we have male and female sports teams, right? Air quotes around those words. We're organizing societies and cultures around gender and the hierarchies that we're creating. So that's very real. Gender is a very real social organizing principle, and one's individual gender is whatever someone tells you that it is. So how do you design for trans users? How do you design for people who experience misalignment with the gender they were assigned at birth? A quick note, I've divided this talk into design and engineering, but I don't really believe so much in that split. It just felt like an easy way to sort of encapsulate it. A first note that I always give is that there's no such thing as neutral work or work without some sort of bias or social valence or social value. So you can be biased towards justice and biased towards inclusion and biased towards care and biased towards equity, right? Or biased away from those, but there's no such thing as anything that's neutral. And that's true for all of the products all of us are making all of the time. So one of the things that I think one of the most important interventions we can make is to think clearly about who we're building for. And so when I say product, I'm talking, for us broadly about a website, but it might be about an app, it might be about an API, it might be about anything that we're designing. So one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is the product for men? And it's a really common thing. We think, oh, here's this thing made for men. But I think what we'll benefit from is asking, is my product made for cisgendered men, so men who are experiencing alignment with the sex they were assigned at birth? Is it for people with penises? Is it for people who are men, which would include trans men? Is it for people who use he and him pronouns? Is it for people who want to appear masculine? So, pictured here is like a man's grooming product that says for men on the container. But it might just be that this product is for people who want a more masculine look, whatever that means in the culture in which it's marketed. And we can ask this similar question about whether or not a product is for women. So here are Bic pens for women. And a lot of times when products are for women, and we see this a lot with products for menstruation, products are not actually for women. Products are for people who menstruate and need menstrual products, or products are for people who are capable of gestation and want to carry babies. Or as is the case in a lot of women in tech events, products and situations are actually for people who experience marginalization based on their gender. So getting some clarity around this, I think, will help make everything else that comes next much simpler. And will help people know that something is not for them, right? If you're making a product made for cisgendered heterosexual women, that makes it easy to know that it's not for me. Okay. And then a final note on language. Is your product for men and women? There's a lot of things where it's like, well, it's for both genders, but there's more than the two. So thinking about people who are not men and women, or people who are literally men and women at the same time. So a lot of this is about, these conceptual interventions we can make, thinking about how we're conceptualizing our product, thinking about the copy on the website. Just a couple of quick updates, depending on the size of your content, will already make things more inclusive. So for first, everybody was a he. If you read old science books or old articles, right, everybody is a he acting in it. And then we went to he, she to be more inclusive, that women might be there. And now we understand that there are people who are excluded by that language. So switching to the neutral they, which we all already use in English, is a very small but very significant change that you can make. If your organization is very progressive, you can also include folks as neo-pronouns. So a neo-pronoun would be something like, one of the most common ones is ze and zay. So it's not he and it's not she. And including those will help people get used to them. Lots of people use them. Thinking about visual design interventions, I have written on this slide, if you must make a checklist, and that's true for all of this. Putting together a checklist to make sure that your organization is designing the inclusive products that perhaps they want to is one of the simplest ways. So one of the simplest interventions you can make is just looking who is in your images and who is absent from your images. So if you're using stock photos on your website, are they all white? Are they all cis? Are they featuring male presenting and female presenting couples? Are they heteronormative, right? Are they repeating this idea that couples are men and women together? If you're trying to be inclusive, I strongly recommend not going to Google and searching for trans imagery, because what you're going to end up with are these pretty played out trans symbols and trans flags. Or something like this, which is a very unfortunate mashup of the gender binary in a bunch of bodies. Instead, you can Google, and this will be on the resources page, inclusive gender diverse stock imagery. So the source caption for this picture reads, "A transgender woman and a non-binary person sit in an office together." Here are two more, which is I believe the caption on this one was a trans masculine doctor. And the caption on the right was a queer woman. Thank you. Someone just posted a link to those in the chat. So what would it mean if when we went to corporate websites, we saw pictures like this? Like, what is that signaling? Is that a signal that your company wants to send? I think the answer is yes. As I always say in my talks, I think people want to be inclusive. I think that they want to do good work. I think they just don't know how. And so one of the simplest ways, most straightforward ways anyway, is to swap out your images. If you're having people generate avatars, you can use a gender neutral avatar generator. Also will be linked in the resources. So thinking about something like the emoji, which makes you pick a gender and then changes what you have access to based on the gender you choose and only has male and female, allowing people to generate an avatar without having to enter a gender. Very good. Okay, thinking about engineering choices. Design choices are also engineering choices. Engineering choices are also design choices. So a super common hot topic in all of this is like, are you asking for gender on your website? I would argue that you almost never have to ask for gender. Sometimes you do. We don't have time in this talk to figure out when it's the right time to ask for gender and when it's not. I do consulting. You can pay me to talk about that later, or talk to some of the consultants that I listed earlier about like ways to get around asking for gender. If you are going to ask for it, and we're going to talk about how to model this data later, if you're going to ask for it, this slide, which says, what is your gender, male, female, other, is super terrible. Drupal's very own Jesse Beach started a gender module many years ago. And it's now been picked up by the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Contribution Team led by Alex McCabe. They're working on improving it. And I think in a Drupal site, if you're gonna grab gender, using the gender module is the best way, because the folks involved in that, I have a lot of faith in them being very thoughtful and very considerate about the options that are available. Also, Jesse Beach is rad. So just another call out for Jesse. If you are thinking about what options you want to give people, I'll give a plug to a project that I've been working on for a couple of years called Open Demographics, which is an open source way to like crowdsource how we're asking about gender, race, class, education, age, demographics questions broadly, I think census questions. So that's a picture of the repo. And here is, thanks to Sage Sharp, who they did amazing work on this, is a list of some of the gender options that you have. Mozilla also did some contribution work on this. So I think one of the most powerful things about this picture is not necessarily the content, but the number of options that are available. So if you're going to model gender inclusively, these are the number of options that you need if you're not going to give people the opportunity to do a write-in. And there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to having people write in. Sometimes when you're asking for gender, what you really are trying to ask is what pronouns people want to use. So the problem is that people's gender that they are telling you and the pronouns they want to use often are not what you think they are, because we can never assume someone's gender based on the pronouns that they use. So one of the things that we get into is people are saying, well, I want to know gender because I want to know pronouns. I want to know gender because I want to know how to assign rooms, or I want to know pronouns because I want to assign rooms based on pronouns. There's all kinds of reasons why people are asking lots of questions. And I think that the crux of asking people for their gender, for their pronouns, is that you can't make assumptions about what people want if you're asking for these. So I signed up for a retreat once where they just asked, what is the gender of the person that you are comfortable rooming with? What is your gender? and they were just both write-in fields, and they had a human being match those up. Okay, so thinking about what it means to be trans and thinking about what it means to have your gender out of alignment with the sex that you were assigned at birth, it means that many trans people engage in transition. And transition is often social. So it's a name change. And a name change typically means an email address change, perhaps an address change, perhaps contact information change, perhaps a photo change, right? It also might include medical transition, which includes hormones, surgery, and sometimes, like in the case of Lynn Conway, who I called out at the top of the talk, a sort of complete reinvention of one's social and cultural identities. So thinking about transition, when you have users enter data, you need to let users change every single piece of data that they've entered, like without exception. And there are, A List Apart has a really good article on how to design inclusively for trans users. And they use this example of someone post-transition, 11 years post-transition, going to their university library or institution library and finding that their gender marker was out of date 11 years later. So users need to be able to change everything. And when they change it, it needs to cascade throughout the system, and it needs to be not recorded that they changed it. And there are some policy exceptions for this, but very few of us are working in fields where policy mandates that we track every single change that a user makes to data that they enter. So if you're going to design trans inclusive systems, you need to think about throwing data away, not keeping the previous value after they've changed it, not caching. So thinking about, like, if I'm transitioning from an old photograph to a new photograph, and that old photograph is cached on the site or indexed by search engines, pushing a new image out to those services, right? What you don't want is for someone to Google you under your new name and find old pictures just because some website cached them. So there's this concept called dead naming, which means using someone's name pre-transition. And it's a form of violence. It causes a lot of trauma to trans people. There's a lot of studies that show how using the wrong pronouns and using the wrong names is a form of violence. Those will also be in the resources. So one of the things that we need to do is throw data away, which is like antithetical to how we're all taught to just hoard and store data forever and ever. Because we're not just, people typing on computers, because we live full and complicated lives. When you're thinking about trans people, you also need to think about how, in general, trans people are less affluent than cis people because of societal oppression, right? So when you're thinking about your users, are you thinking about people who have regular internet access, stable work, and regular housing? 20% of trans people have experienced housing discrimination. But again, those are just the people who are out and who admitted to it. So the number is likely quite higher. If you're asking users to interact with other users and user-generated content, we need to think about the ways that user-generated content is often transphobic, homophobic, and violent. So are you protecting your trans users when you're exposing them to content made by other users? There's a great book called Behind the Screen by Sarah Roberts about what it means to engage in moderation, the workers who do moderation, and what happens when you have large volumes of user-generated content. Okay, someone is posting a link to Trans 101 resource in the chat. Thank you for that. Careful with those. I think that's really great. And I just want to say as an aside, to be very careful about resources generated not by trans people. There are a lot of well-meaning cis folks trying to educate other cis folks on how to be a good ally to trans people. And a lot of times those are kind of questionable. So when you're looking at these lists, like the one shared in the chat, thank you, Margie, make sure that they're by trans people who have lived experience with the topic. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about before Q&A, is that right? Yes. Checking time, is if you want to track gender, if you are on a team that needs to model gender and use it as a data point, how can you make a trans inclusive data model? Is that a thing that's possible? And the answer is like, kind of, it's complicated. So here are two gender statements about one person. In this case, the person is me. So at one point in my life, at home and in my social life, my gender is non-binary. And at work, my gender is female because I was working in a very transphobic place. And I just, being out wasn't worth it. So if you're modeling a user's gender, how can you account for both of these situations? And what these statements tell me is that gender is contextual, right? In some cases, you have to pretend to be cisgendered in order to stay safe. So how do I model a user's gender in a way that's inclusive of this experience? So here is an ER diagram that I generated in like my SQL workbench. We got 4 tables. You've got a user table, which extends outward, right? To all kinds of other user tables that might exist. We have a context, we have a gender, and we have a statement. That statement pulled together. So with this model, you could generate these statements about a user. And with a near infinite number of contexts. It might be home, work, gym, club, different country, right? If I go to a different country, I'm going to go and pretend to be cisgendered. If I'm in a more liberal country, I will be out. So already, this is far more complicated than letting someone click a radio button or a checkbox and move on, right? But that statement doesn't include pronouns. And we, again, don't want to assume that a user's gender is, that a user's gender determines their pronouns. So a version 2. When I'm at home, my gender is non-binary and I use they, them pronouns. When I'm at work, my gender is female and I use she, her pronouns. And these statements don't mean that your gender changes, right? To be clear, it's not that my gender, in this example, is one thing at home and something at work. It's that if you're going to interact with me, I'm going to expect you to help me stay safe at work. So I'm going to let my gender be perceived as female. So to update it, right, my safety gender is female, and I'm tolerating she, her pronouns for a certain reason. So again, if we're going to inclusively model gender, if we're going to go there, I'm arguing that we need all of this. So here's a new data model where we have a gender table, a context table, that same user table. We've added a pronoun table and an example sentence. We've added verbs to describe the pronouns. I use, I tolerate, I prefer, I don't want, right? You could perhaps say, in this context, I'll use any gender and any pronouns. In this context, I will not accept he, him pronouns. So this data model will let us generate all of those statements. But we could keep iterating, right? And we could say, okay, well, when I'm at work, my gender is non-binary and I'm sometimes female in this other context. My name at home is this, my name at work is something else. I'm thinking specifically about a colleague of mine who works in queer healthcare and performs HIV testing. And so sometimes he'll meet a client out at a social location, give them a test, but at home they're still in the closet. And so when he calls them at home, he needs to know the name that they're using in order to keep them safe. So we could continue to expand this data model a lot in order to continue to be inclusive. So here's an example, and this is just like one way to implement this. And I think having gone through this example, which I've done for some research projects in work, my conclusion is that we shouldn't try to model gender unless we absolutely have to. And if you're someone who absolutely has to model gender, I would love to talk to you about why, just because I would like to understand more. So all of the resources that I mentioned will be up on my website. I will tweet the link. My Twitter handle is on the slides. I will tweet the link after this talk sometime later today or tomorrow morning. Please evaluate the session. There's a link in the chat, and it's going to be on the slide deck, which I will also upload to the website. There's the closing slide that they want me to use, and it is now time for your questions. Okay, so I see a question from Mark, and I didn't see too many others throughout, so if I missed it, please repost it. A question from Mark, which reads, what issues arise for transgender users in the areas of access to the web and accessibility during use? That's a great question. So someone's gender identity does not itself cause any issues in accessibility, right? Transgender folks might also have other sorts of accessibility needs. They might use screen readers, they might have low vision, but their transgenderness does not itself require any extra accessibility in terms of like, in terms of the kind of the way that I think about it as a software engineer. However, in terms of access to the web, I think it's a really important question that requires us to think about how do people who are out as trans experience opportunities, experience access, experience housing, right? Experience income inequality. And when we start asking those questions, we start asking something like, well, do trans people have the same access to the internet as cisgender people? Well, what do you need to have access to the internet, right? You probably need a house. You need a way to pay for an internet. You need to be able to pass a credit check. You need all of these things. And in order to get those things, you need to have a stable job. In order to get a stable job, right? So then we are invited to remember that our work is not neutral, and that our work is directly interacting with all of these social forces that are affecting people, and that those social forces are deeply racialized, right? A trans person's experience of getting income inequality is going to be affected by their race. Brandon asked the question, is data destruction okay to be eventual? For example, I might want to send a security email, someone changed your profile, was that you? I think, yeah, right? I think I'm not arguing that we need to immediately destroy. I'm arguing that we need to destroy pretty quickly. So I think if you have a security policy, a lot of times things will get backed up for 24 hours and then destroyed. I think sure, someone goes in, makes a bunch of updates, you send an email confirmation, everything's okay. At the next cycle, everything goes away. I think that's totally reasonable. And what we don't want to do is say, okay, you've changed it. We're going to hold on to that change indefinitely, and we're going to let you revert at any time. I just don't think it's worth doing that sort of harm to trans people for a feature that probably won't get used that often. Carly asked a great question about accessibility for an image of a person that needs alt text. Yes, always put alt text on your images. Carly asks, what would be the most descriptive alt text? I try to avoid woman sits, man shakes hand in case the person is non-binary, especially if you don't know the person's name. That's a super good question. So the stock images that I showed you came with gender descriptions that I think maybe Mark posted it in the chat. One of the ways that I've seen it done is just a description of the person. A person with short brown hair sits at a desk. They are wearing a blazer and a light cotton blouse, because the gender doesn't matter, right? I've also seen it done. A queer website whose name escapes me at the moment will also include skin tone. So they'll say a light-skinned person, a brown-skinned person, a dark-skinned person sits, wearing a stethoscope and a doctor's lab coat. Okay. Yeah, and I really like that question a lot. Okay, Jack asks, As a developer and not a product owner, what can I use to strengthen my argument to not track gender when the product owner strongly requests that we capture it? Most of the time, there's nothing in the system that requires it, but I always have product owners that Jack has to talk out of it, and the product owners never agree with him. That's a super good question. I think, one of the reasons that this talk is not about the tech pipeline is because most of us don't have the power to control the tech pipeline, right? We don't have the power. Most of us are not hiring and firing large swaths of developers to change the demographics of our team. What we do have is this little bit of power, like Jack talks about, to fight against including a gender field when one is not necessary. And I think one of the things, Jack, that you can do, that we can all do, is to develop a sense of why the ways that we track gender is unfair and hostile. And I'm making note to myself. And present resources, right? Like about the ways that tracking gender causes problems. So I'm thinking about a piece by Os Keys, which I'll make a note to put in the resources, about the way putting people in data is harmful. So there's a lot of arguments going around right now that just in general, being put in data causes harm to people who are in any way not normal, who are not common, right? Who are not cisgendered, not heterosexual, not white, not disabled. Yeah. So I wish I had an easy answer for you, Jack. I also just want to acknowledge that that's really hard work and good work that you're doing, and I thank you for doing it. I think one of the things that I would be interested in hearing is the business reason for tracking gender. A lot of times it's for marketing, right? We'll say, well, we want to know the demographics of our users so that we can better market to women 30 to 35 who we believe to be purchasing in this way. And so it might be that there's a business case for doing different kinds of demographic marketing. I would love to have a conversation with folks about ways that they've approached that. Because I luckily have never had a product owner disagree with me that strongly on it. Steve asks, can I describe a product model where tracking gender would be mandatory? Yes, any kind of healthcare. Any kind of healthcare. And I think someone mentioned it up in the chat that if you're doing, a lot of times federally qualified health centers require certain kinds of gender tracking. And so coupled with when you've got two policy overlaps, one of which says, I must know the gender of every person who you're servicing in order for you to continue to receive state federal funding. And another policy that says you must keep all data for 4 to 6 years in offsite backups, right? What you have then is a system that entrenches a person's gender even after transition, right? So you've got a person who wants to make a gender change, and then we're storing it. And so I think of people who experience gender fluidly, who some days will come up and answer a questionnaire and tell you that they're male. Some days will come up and tell you that they're non-binary. Some days will come up and tell you that they're female, all of which are true and valid. And having that record be stored because of the data storage policies. And so we end up with this very unfortunate system storing a person's gender in ways that can be problematic. Yeah, government forms. Victoria asks, when collecting information to give health information specific to people with certain body parts, what's the best way to ask for that information? I think that's a great question. I have seen it done well by simply asking, so for example, right, if you are offering information about menstruation, cramps, birth control for people who might get pregnant, you can just simply say, I want to give you information to prevent pregnancy. Are you a person who could get pregnant? Are you interested in that information? Most people are able to have conversations about medical words, not everybody. And that tends to be the most inclusive way to ask. Because again, lots of people who can get pregnant are men using he, him pronouns. Lots of people who menstruate are men and in general, not women. And I think about this a lot with erectile dysfunction medication, which is marketed towards men, but lots of women have penises. Lots of people who are not men have penises and might be interested in that. So simply saying, I would like to give you information about penile health. Is that a thing that you need? Christina asks, we display profiles for contact information on our website and have dynamic products that one authors. There are several options to include pronouns. Would it be ideal to have an open field and give option to where that would be displayed, like to the right of the full name or below the name? That's a great question. I traditionally do it right after a name because it's the hardest to miss. So I've found that if it's my name, like name, title, email, phone, pronouns, anywhere lower on the stack, it gets missed. So I literally have in my signature either like Nikki Stevens, pronouns, they, them underneath it, or it's like Nikki Stevens and then immediately in parentheses, they, them. And I think letting people just enter it all in an open field makes the most sense. There are lots of folks who don't want their pronouns displayed for a variety of reasons, and we want to honor that as well. Another question. It has happened that a person who is a source in a lot of articles has transitioned to using different pronouns and perhaps a different name. And so they manually went through to change those pronouns. Are there any recommendations for making that process easier and or avoiding it? Super good question. You could engineer it, right? You could have, if a source author were a user, you could have a pronoun field just internally and use that pronoun variable. My instinct would be to automate it through software engineering, but there is no way around it. Nope, actually there's no way around it. Because while there has been some discourse about like, should we just use they, them pronouns for people, for a lot of binary trans people, so I'm thinking about trans women, feel very strongly that they fought very hard to be called she, her, and they don't want to be called they, right? So calling someone they when they specifically want she, her is also problematic. So there's no way to avoid it, but the only way that I would approach it to make it easier probably would be to automate it. But as we know, letting software engineers automate things isn't a great solution always. Sandy asks, for a company that requires gender for some reason, is adding a third option of non-binary an appropriate potential solution? Thank you for asking that. I don't think so, because there are people who identify as not male, not female, and also not non-binary. Is it better than not having another option? I guess. I think, I've been a part of large surveys that let users write in their gender, and in general, they had fine results. We didn't get too many attack helicopters or unicorns or things. I also don't know. I also, am not going to make a case that letting people enter unicorn in a gender field is a terrible thing. So I think, for a company that requires gender for a reason that is unchangeable, a third option is insufficient. Yeah. On open demographics, there's a list of other ways to ask. One of the things, a common mistake that happens is you'll see male, female, and then transgender, or male, female, non-binary, transgender. Those are also insufficient. And so, if you're going to ask for it, you need to give people more options than that. Let's see. Margie asks about how to get pronouns for people who you don't have access to, like dead people. Good question. I think I would err on the side of they for people who you're not sure, as a sign of respect. There's a lot of really rich history of folks who engaged in what we would call today something like cross-dressing, something like gender bending, and lots of questions about like what pronouns might they have used when they were wearing a dress or wearing pants or doing this male job or behaving in this female way. And it's all speculation inflected by our current moment and our current set of conversations. And so I think, especially when you can't know, I would just default to they, unless you have a lot of strong evidence, including like perhaps like diaries written by the person themselves about what they want. John reminds us that you can click ask to share audio and video, and I can approve that. None of you have. Yes, this talk will be available as a video afterwards. Sandy clarifies, oh, John, I'll get to you next. Sandy asks, can we use a prefer not to say? So male, female, perhaps something else, prefer not to say, totally. Prefer not to say is super good. I think prefer not to say should always be there. I think there's also just sort of a form of violence, sort of like harm in saying, are you a man, are you a female, or do you want to keep it a secret? Right? Like that's also kind of hard for people to be seeing. Okay. John.
Hey. Is it working?
Hi.
Hey. I'll break the ice and be quick.
Great.
No
rush.
Part of the talk, some of the slides at the beginning made me feel like it would be really useful to like marketing people, and like I feel like if anything, like they're focused on sales, and like in this modern day, I feel like there's a kind of a hunger to do to be more kind of aware of how your own products are marketed, and you see more and more diversity in commercials and stuff like that. Have you thought about like giving a presentation like this geared towards marketing? Because it's like you just about kind of design and tech, but I feel like that would be really impactful because they really they have some control over the presentation of stuff, right? Yeah,
I would be happy to give this talk to a team of marketers. Someone please connect me with your teams of marketers who want to pay me to come and give this talk. But yeah, I mean, I think like one of the things that's tricky is, we can look at the way products are marketed and say, this is dysfunctional, right? Bic pens for her.
There's so much. I mean,
it makes no sense.
Kid stuff is right. Like cartoons is still so struggling with just like the basics.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. Everything is so gendered. And so stuck in this binary of like pens for her, razors for him, razors for her, that there's certainly a business opportunity, right, for someone who wants to come in and say, okay, what about razors for neither, right? What about non-gendered products that are just for people who have hair that need to be shaved, right? I think the tricky thing about that is that like capitalism is itself also problematic. And so doing work that like reinforces capitalism and reinforces capitalism's ability to continue to market products to us is also really tricky, right? Like, so I will never shade a trans person for trying to get paid. And also I worry about like the amount of data that we would need to collect in order to say, hey, here's a product designed specifically for you, assigned female at birth trans person, right? So I think like, as Brandon just pointed out in chat, like marketing people did a lot of harm trying to pigeonhole people into categories in the first part. And there's a great book on the political power of categories that I will also try to remember to put in my slides. So yeah, thank you for that question, John. If anyone else wants to put their face up.
I would love to see you give it, like you could just take those set of slides. I mean, if you just said, here's a new marketing talk, people would be begging you for it to come talk to them about, honestly. Like, look at these basic questions in chat, like, where would you put a razor? It's like, actually, it turns out it's really not that complicated. Like, there's so much software. I mean, it is, but like, I feel like people are trying to solve this stuff now. Like, you go into stores, especially after the pandemic, and people are like completely rearranging everything. Like,
totally.
So I don't know. I think the way you presented it, I think, was just so accessible today, and I really,
thank you.
I thought it was just great, and I just wanted to encourage you to kind of like keep going with what you're doing, and yeah, the design of apps and stuff is important, but yeah, just something hit me about like you putting up the big pen and all that stuff. So I'll step out, and someone else maybe could jump in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Good to see you. Laura asked, please, anyone else who would like to put their face on video? I would love to see your face. Laura asks, any advice for how to be an ally when you work in public service and not everyone you work with is also an ally? Yeah, that's real. That's real, that's hard. I think like one of the things that I think about a lot as a white person doing work on the evils of white supremacy is this idea, right, of like how hard it is, how hard it can feel to continually butt up against people, other white people who don't want to listen, right? You're like, this is hard to try to do this work and continually be in conflict with people who are not interested. And then I remind myself that it's my job, right? It is my obligation as a white person in this white supremacist society to continue to do this work, even when other white people around me don't want to hear it. And I feel like the work of allyship, especially, in this context, right? If you're a cis person working with other cis people who just don't want to hear it, it's still easier than being a trans person who is likely to be homeless, who is probably in the closet, and who are trans people getting murdered. Trump is actively passing bans to prevent transgender people from getting healthcare, right? So you can be a trans person, go into a hospital with a broken arm, and doctors can decline to treat you just because you're trans, even though all you have is a broken arm that they know how to fix. So I think it's more just like, I want to acknowledge that it's hard. I want to acknowledge that it feels hard, and that like it can feel like it's coming at an expensive social cost. And I think in cases like that, the thing that I always recommend is for you to find one or two other people who are also cis and who are also allies, that you can workshop together how to handle the people who are standing in your way. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Ooh, Sugar Overflow is here.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say hi.
Hi. How are you?
That was so great. I loved it.
Thanks. But now that you're here, you have to ask a question.
I don't have a question.
All right, well, there's
answer other questions.
Yeah, and until someone else asks a question, it's just you.
I tried to look up the book, The Political Power of Categories, but I just couldn't find it.
It's called Sorting Things Out, and it's a pretty academic book. So I'm gonna put that one up in the resources, but I'm also gonna find a more accessible one.
Gotcha.
Oh, Mario has a question, and maybe next sessions are starting in 2 minutes. Okay, we'll let people go. Mario has a question about how to promote inclusivity within an organization. I will refer Mario both to the consultants that I mentioned earlier and to the work of the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion group here in the Drupal community. All right, friends who are leaving for sessions, I'll let everyone go. Please remember to evaluate the session and tweet at me if you would like to. Bye, everyone.